The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Highgrove House as Charles sat alone in his study, surrounded by boxes of Diana's personal belongings. 3 months had passed since the tragic accident in Paris, and he still couldn't bring himself to go through her things. The staff had carefully packed everything from Kensington Palace, and now these cardboard containers held the remnants of a life cut tragically short. Charles poured himself another glass of whiskey, his third that evening. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it couldn't wash away the guilt that consumed him daily. He stared at the boxes, knowing he should donate Diana's clothes to charity as she would have wanted, but he couldn't face the memories each item would bring. His hands trembled as he opened the first box. Inside were Diana's favorite scarves, still carrying the faint scent of her perfume. He lifted a blue silk scarf she had worn to William's school sports day, remembering how radiant she looked cheering from the sidelines. Their marriage may have fallen apart, but she had always been an incredible mother. The second box contained photographs, hundreds of them. Pictures of Diana with William and Harry at Disney World, laughing as they rode the teacup ride. Images from her charity work, holding hands with AIDS patients when the world still feared to touch them. Photos from their wedding day, when they both believed in fairy tales and happy endings. Charles wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He had been so young, so pressured by duty and expectation. Diana had been even younger, thrust into a world she never understood, married to a man who couldn't give her the love she desperately needed. As he reached deeper into the box, his fingers brushed against something leather-bound. He pulled out a small burgundy diary with a golden clasp. His heart stopped. He recognized it immediately. Diana used to write in it every night before bed during their early years of marriage. He had often watched her from across their bedroom, curious about what thoughts she committed to those pages, but he had never asked. Charles held the diary in his hands, feeling its weight. Should he read it? Diana was gone now. Her privacy had died with her. But these were her most intimate thoughts, never meant for anyone else's eyes. He set it on his desk and walked to the window, watching the rain cascade down the glass. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight. Charles returned to his desk, the diary still sitting there like a forbidden treasure. His curiosity finally overcame his hesitation. He opened the clasp and turned to the first page. The date was written in Diana's familiar handwriting, June 15th, 1981, just weeks before their wedding. Charles's pulse quickened as he began to read her words, written by a nervous 19-year-old girl who had no idea what lay ahead. I can barely sleep, Diana had written. Tomorrow I have another fitting for the wedding dress. I still can't believe this is really happening. Sometimes I feel like Cinderella, and sometimes I feel terrified. Charles seems so distant lately, so formal. I wish he would talk to me the way he talks to his plants. I hear him in the garden sometimes, and his voice is so gentle, so caring. I wonder if he'll ever speak to me that way. Charles felt a sharp pain in his chest. Even then, Diana had seen through his formality to the tenderness he kept hidden. He continued reading page after page of her hopes and dreams, her excitement about becoming a princess, her determination to make their marriage work. But as he progressed through the diary, the tone began to change. The entries from their honeymoon aboard Britannia were filled with confusion and hurt. Diana wrote about Charles bringing books about Camilla on their honeymoon, about how he would stare out at the sea instead of talking to her. She described feeling like an ornament, something beautiful to be displayed but not truly valued. I tried to talk to him about my day. One entry read, about the people I met and the places we visited, but he just nodded politely like I was a stranger making small talk. I thought marriage would bring us closer, but I feel more alone now than I ever did before. I see the way he looks at me sometimes, like he's trying to figure out what to do with me. Charles had to stop reading. The whiskey glass in his hand was shaking, and he realized he was crying. These weren't the bitter words of an angry ex-wife. These were the honest feelings of a young woman trying desperately to connect with her husband, not understanding why she couldn't reach him. He remembered those early days differently. He had thought he was being respectful, giving her space to adjust to royal life. He hadn't realized that his politeness felt like rejection to her. He had been raised to keep his emotions private, to maintain dignity at all costs. But Diana had needed warmth, spontaneity, and emotional connection. The next entries detailed her growing isolation. Diana wrote about wandering the halls of Buckingham Palace, feeling lost and overwhelmed. She described the suffocating protocol, the constant scrutiny, the way everyone around her seemed to know exactly what to do while she stumbled through each day, terrified of making a mistake. "I miss my old life," she had written. "I miss being able to run to the shops without a security detail. I miss my friends, my freedom, my identity. I feel like Diana Spencer died the day I put on that wedding dress, and now I'm supposed to be someone else, but nobody told me who that person is supposed to be." Charles closed the diary, unable to read more. He walked to the fireplace and stared into the dying embers. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the pain in those blue eyes that the whole world had fallen in love with? He had been so focused on duty, on maintaining the proper image, that he had failed to see his wife drowning right beside him. The clock struck 1 in the morning. Charles knew he wouldn't sleep tonight. He returned to his desk, opened the diary again, and continued reading, knowing that with each page, he was about to discover truths that would change everything he thought he knew about his marriage, about Diana, and about himself. Charles turned the page with trembling fingers, his eyes already swollen from tears. The next entry was dated August 1981, just weeks after their royal wedding that the world had called a fairy tale. Diana's handwriting looked more hurried, less careful than her earlier entries. "I'm pregnant," the entry began, and Charles felt his heart skip a beat. He remembered the day Diana had told him about William, but he had never known her private thoughts about it. "I should be overjoyed, but I'm terrified. Charles seemed pleased when I told him, but in that polite way he has about everything. He shook my hand. My husband shook my hand when I told him I was carrying his child. I wanted him to hold me, to share this moment with me, but he just said, 'How wonderful, Diana,' and went back to reading his papers." Charles set the diary down and buried his face in his hands. He remembered that moment clearly now. He had been thrilled about the pregnancy, but he had been raised never to show excessive emotion, even joy. His own parents had barely hugged him as a child. He thought he was being dignified, appropriate, but Diana had needed celebration, excitement, shared wonder. He picked up the diary again. The next entries chronicled her pregnancy with William, and Charles was shocked to read about struggles he had never known existed. Diana wrote about severe morning sickness that lasted all day, about feeling exhausted and emotional, about desperately wanting Charles to comfort her but not knowing how to ask. "The morning sickness is horrible," one entry read. "I can barely keep anything down and I feel dizzy most of the time. Charles brought me tea and toast this morning, which was sweet, but then he left for his meetings. I spent the day alone, feeling sick and scared. I called my mother, but she just told me this was normal and I needed to be strong for the royal family. I don't want to be strong right now. I want someone to take care of me." Charles remembered now how difficult Diana's first pregnancy had been, but he had thought she was managing well. She had never complained to him, never told him how she was really feeling. He had interpreted her silence as strength, not realizing it was resignation. The entries continued through William's birth, and Charles was amazed to read Diana's detailed account of that incredible day. She wrote about her labor, her fears, her overwhelming love for their son the moment she held him. But what broke Charles's heart was reading about how alone she had felt even in that moment of triumph. "William is perfect," Diana had written the day after the birth. 10 fingers, 10 toes in Charles's ears. "I've never loved anything so completely in my life. But when the nurses left and it was just Charles and me with our son, I felt this terrible loneliness." Charles held William like he was made of glass, so careful, so formal. I wanted to see him cry with joy or laugh or do something that showed he felt this miracle too. Instead, he said William was a fine boy and kissed my forehead like I was his sick aunt. Charles was sobbing now, deep, painful sobs that came from somewhere he had kept locked away for decades. He had been overjoyed at William's birth, but he had been raised to believe that showing too much emotion was weakness, especially in front of staff and doctors. He had thought he was being strong for Diana, protective and reliable, but she had needed him to be human. The diary entries from William's early months painted a picture of a young mother struggling with postnatal depression, though Diana didn't have those words for what she was experiencing. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed, about crying for hours while William slept, about looking at other mothers and wondering why motherhood seemed so natural to them when she felt like she was failing every day. "I love William more than life itself," one entry read. But I don't think I'm a good mother. He cries so much, and I don't always know why. The nannies seem to settle him better than I do. Sometimes I wonder if he would be better off without me. Charles comes to say goodnight to William every evening, but he barely looks at me. I feel invisible in my own home, unnecessary in my own family. Charles had to stop reading again. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. How had he missed her pain? How had he not seen that the woman he had married was drowning in depression and isolation? He had thought the nannies were helping her, giving her support, but Diana had seen them as evidence of her own inadequacy. When he returned to the diary, the entries began to mention Camilla more frequently. Diana had started to piece together the truth about Charles's relationship with his old flame. And reading her growing awareness was like watching someone's heart break in slow motion. I found a photo in Charles's study today, she had written. It was tucked inside one of his books, and it fell out when I was looking for something to read. It was a picture of him and Camilla from years ago before we met. They looked so happy together, so natural. I stared at that photo for a long time, and I realized I've never seen Charles look at me that way. Not even on our wedding day. The entries that followed showed Diana trying desperately to win her husband's love. She wrote about planning special dinners, about trying to share his interests, about studying agriculture and architecture, so she could contribute to his conversations. She documented her efforts to be the perfect royal wife, attending every engagement with a smile, never complaining about the grueling schedule. I'm getting better at the royal duties, one entry read. The crowd seemed to like me, which surprises everyone, including me. But Charles doesn't seem impressed. If anything, he seems annoyed by the attention I get. Yesterday, a little girl gave me flowers and told me I was like a princess in a fairy tale. Charles didn't say anything, but I could see in his eyes that he thought it was all silly nonsense. Charles remembered those early engagements, how the public had taken to Diana immediately. He had been proud of her success, but he had also felt threatened by it. Diana was natural with people in a way he had never been, and her popularity had made him feel inadequate, though he had never admitted that to anyone, especially not to her. The diary revealed Diana's growing understanding of royal protocol and her increasing confidence in public, but it also showed her deepening loneliness at home. She wrote about long evenings when Charles would read or work on his speeches while she sat quietly nearby, both of them in the same room but feeling miles apart. Sometimes I think we're like actors in a play, Diana had written. During the day, we perform our roles as the perfect royal couple. We smile and wave and say the right things. But when the curtain falls and we're alone, we don't know how to be real with each other. I don't think Charles knows who I really am. And I'm starting to wonder if I know who he is either. Charles closed the diary and walked to his desk where he kept a photograph of Diana from their engagement announcement. She looked so young, so hopeful, so trusting. He picked up the frame and studied her face, seeing now what he had missed then. The vulnerability behind her smile, the uncertainty in her eyes, the desperate hope that this fairy tale would have a happy ending. The diary had already revealed more about his marriage than 20 years of living it had taught him. And he was only partway through. He dreaded what other truths waited in those pages, but he knew he had to keep reading. He owed Diana that much at least. The dawn light was beginning to filter through the heavy curtains as Charles continued reading, his coffee long gone cold. The diary entries now covered the period when Harry was born, and Diana's writing revealed a different woman, still vulnerable but stronger, more determined to fight for her marriage. Harry arrived early this morning, Diana had written in September 1984. He's smaller than William was, with red hair that Charles pretends not to notice but I can see makes him uncomfortable. People will talk, they always do, but Harry is Charles's son and anyone with eyes can see it. He has Charles's hands, long and elegant, and when he sleeps he makes the same little sighing sound Charles does. Charles smiled through his tears, remembering Harry's birth. The red hair had surprised everyone, though it came from Diana's side of the family. He had been more relaxed during Diana's second pregnancy, and he remembered being genuinely excited about Harry's arrival. Charles held Harry for almost an hour today. The next entry continued. Really held him. Not that careful, formal way he held William. He talked to Harry in a soft voice, telling him about the gardens at Highgrove, about the horses he would learn to ride. For a moment I saw the father I had hoped he would be, the husband I had dreamed of. Then the equerry came in with some urgent papers, and Charles handed Harry back to me like he was returning a borrowed book. The entries that followed showed Diana's growing frustration with Charles's inability to prioritize family over duty. She wrote about missed bedtime stories, canceled family dinners, and special moments interrupted by royal obligations. But what struck Charles most was Diana's growing awareness of her own strength. "I realize now that I can't keep waiting for Charles to change," one entry read. "I can't keep hoping he'll suddenly become the husband I need him to be. But I can be the mother I want to be. William and Harry need at least one parent who puts them first, who remembers that before they are princes, they are little boys who need love and attention and silly games." Charles read about Diana's efforts to give their sons a normal childhood. She wrote about taking them to McDonald's, about letting them wear jeans to the cinema, about teaching them to understand the world outside palace walls. She documented their laughter, their questions, their innocent observations about their unusual life. "William asked me today why Daddy doesn't live with us anymore," Diana had written during one of their trial separations. "How do you explain to a 10-year-old that sometimes grown-ups can't find a way to make love work? I told him that Daddy and I both love him and Harry more than anything, even if we can't live together. But I could see in his eyes that he thinks it's somehow his fault. Children always do." The guilt hit Charles like a physical blow. He had thought the boys were too young to understand. But Diana's diary revealed how deeply the marital problems had affected them. She wrote about William's nightmares, Harry's sudden shyness around strangers, both boys' desperate attempts to bring their parents back together. As the diary progressed, Charles read about Diana's growing involvement with her charities. Her entries revealed how much her humanitarian work meant to her, how it gave her a sense of purpose beyond being a decorative royal wife. "I visited the AIDS ward again today," she had written. "The press followed, of course, and I know some people think I do this for attention. But when I hold these dying men's hands, when I see the fear leave their eyes because someone finally touched them without gloves, I know this is why I'm here. This is what I'm supposed to do with this position I never asked for." Charles was struck by Diana's insight into her own role. While he had been focused on traditional royal duties, Diana had understood instinctively how to use her position to make a real difference. She had seen possibilities where he had only seen protocols. The diary entries about landmines were particularly moving. Diana wrote about her trip to Angola, about walking through those cleared fields knowing that one wrong step could kill her. She wrote about meeting children who had lost limbs to hidden explosives, about the determination that grew in her to make the world pay attention to this forgotten crisis. "Charles thinks my landmine campaign is too political," she had written, after one particularly heated argument. "He says the royal family should stay neutral. But how can I stay neutral when I've seen what these weapons do to innocent people? How can I worry about protocol when children are dying? Sometimes I think Charles cares more about not offending politicians than about saving lives." Charles winced, remembering his opposition to Diana's landmine work. He had been concerned about the political implications, about maintaining the monarchy's neutrality. But reading her words now, he realized Diana had been right. She had been ahead of her time, seeing the humanitarian mission that royalty could serve in the modern world. The diary also revealed Diana's struggles with the media attention that followed her everywhere. She wrote about the constant photographers, the invasive headlines, the way every gesture was analyzed and criticized. "I can't buy a coffee without it becoming a news story," one entry read. "Today the paper said I looked tired, which means I must be having a breakdown. Yesterday they said I looked too happy, which means I'm being frivolous while people are suffering. I can't win. Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I had married someone ordinary, someone who loved me for who I am, not what I represent." But despite her frustrations with the media, Diana's diary showed her growing understanding of how to use publicity for good. She wrote about deliberately choosing which charities to visit, based on which ones needed attention, about timing her appearances to maximize coverage for important causes. "If the photographers are going to follow me anyway," she had written, "at least I can make sure they photograph things that matter. Let them take pictures of me with AIDS patients, with homeless people, with landmine victims. If my face sells newspapers, at least I can make sure the stories do some good." Charles was amazed by Diana's strategic thinking. While he had always seen media attention as something to be endured, Diana had learned to harness it as a force for change. She had been far more sophisticated about public relations than anyone, including himself, had given her credit for. The entries from the final years of their marriage were the hardest to read. Diana's writing showed a woman who had finally found her strength, but realized it was too late to save her marriage. She wrote about the loneliness of living separate lives under the same roof, about the sadness of watching their sons navigate their parents' obvious unhappiness. "I don't hate Charles," one of the last entries about their marriage read. "I think I understand him better now than I did when we were trying to be married. He's a good man trapped in an impossible role, just like I was a good woman trapped in an impossible marriage. We brought out the worst in each other because we needed such different things. I needed warmth and spontaneity and emotional connection. He needed peace and predictability and respect for tradition. Neither of us was wrong, but we were wrong for each other." Charles closed the diary for a moment, overwhelmed by Diana's insight and forgiveness. Even in her private thoughts, even when documenting her deepest pain, she had tried to understand his perspective. She had been more generous to him in her diary than he had been to her in their marriage. As he opened the diary to continue reading, Charles knew he was approaching the entries from after their divorce, when Diana had found her independence but also faced her greatest challenges alone. He braced himself for what other truths were waiting in those pages. Charles reached for another tissue as he turned to the entries from after their divorce was finalized. Diana's handwriting had changed. It was bolder now, more confident, but there were pages where he could see the ink had been smudged by tears. "It's official now," Diana had written in August 1996. "I am no longer Her Royal Highness. I am just Diana, Princess of Wales. Strange how losing a title can feel like finding yourself. I cried when the papers were signed. Not because I wanted to stay married to Charles, but because I was mourning the girl who thought fairy tales could come true. She died today, and maybe that's for the best." Charles felt his chest tighten. He had been relieved when the divorce was finalized, thinking it would end the tension and allow them both to move forward. He hadn't realized that for Diana, it represented the death of every dream she had carried into their marriage. The entries that followed showed Diana trying to build a new life for herself. She wrote about the freedom of making her own decisions, choosing her own friends, setting her own schedule. But she also wrote about the overwhelming responsibility of raising William and Harry largely on her own. The boys spent the weekend with Charles. One entry read, "They came back full of stories about Highgrove, about riding horses and helping in the garden. I'm glad they have that time with their father, but I see how they study my face when they talk about him, looking for signs that it hurts me. Children shouldn't have to protect their parents' feelings. I try to smile and ask questions about their adventures, but inside I feel this terrible loneliness. They have a father they love, and I'm glad for that, but I have no one to share the parenting with anymore." Charles hadn't realized how isolated Diana had felt as a single mother. He had assumed she preferred having full control over the boys' upbringing, but her diary revealed how much she had valued their partnership as parents, even when their marriage was failing. Diana's entries about her charity work during this period showed a woman hitting her stride. She wrote about her trip to Bosnia, about holding refugee children and promising herself she would never forget their faces. She documented her growing confidence in public speaking, her increasing ability to connect complex issues to human stories. "I gave a speech about mental health today," she had written. "5 years ago, I would have been terrified to speak about something so personal, so controversial. But I looked out at that audience and saw people who needed to hear that it's okay not to be okay, that seeking help is strength, not weakness. I talked about my own struggles with depression and eating disorders. The palace won't like it, but I don't care anymore. I'm not representing the palace now. I'm representing people who suffer in silence." Charles was struck by Diana's courage. While he had always been careful to avoid controversial topics, Diana had been willing to risk criticism to address issues that mattered. She had used her own pain to help others, transforming her struggles into a source of strength. The diary also revealed Diana's romantic relationships after their divorce. Charles had known about some of them from the media coverage, but reading Diana's private thoughts about her search for love was heartbreaking. "I went to dinner with Hasnat tonight," she had written about the heart surgeon she had fallen deeply in love with. "He makes me laugh in a way I had forgotten was possible. When I'm with him, I'm not a princess or an ex-wife or a media target. I'm just Diana. He doesn't care about my title or my past or my public image. He cares about my mind, my heart, my dreams for the future." Charles read page after page about Diana's relationship with Dr. Hasnat Khan, seeing through her words how happy this quiet, serious man had made her. Diana wrote about their simple dates, their long conversations about medicine and philosophy, the way he challenged her intellectually while accepting her emotionally. Hasnat says he doesn't want to live in the public eye. One entry read, "He wants a private life with someone who can give him that. I understand, but it breaks my heart. I can't stop being who I am, can't escape the cameras and the headlines. I'm trapped by my own fame, unable to love freely because any man who loves me inherits my prison." Charles felt a wave of guilt reading about Diana's struggles with relationships. Her fame, partly a result of their marriage, had become a barrier to her finding happiness. Every man she dated became headline news, their privacy invaded, their motives questioned. The entries about Dodi Fayed painted a different picture than the media had portrayed. Diana wrote about him with fondness but not the deep love she had felt for Hasnat Khan. Dodi was charming and generous, but Diana seemed to see him more as a companion than a soulmate. "Dodi understands what it's like to live in the public eye," she had written during their summer romance. "His father has been dealing with media attention for years, so he knows the rules of this strange game. We can have fun together without him being shocked by the photographers or overwhelmed by the attention. It's not the deep love I had hoped to find, but it's companionship. And maybe that's enough for now." Charles was surprised by Diana's pragmatic approach to her relationship with Dodi. The media had portrayed it as a passionate romance, but Diana's diary revealed someone who had learned to moderate her expectations, to find contentment rather than constantly seeking perfect love. But the diary entries that affected Charles most deeply were the ones about William and Harry. Diana wrote extensively about her fears for their future, her hopes for their happiness, her determination to prepare them for the unique challenges they would face. "William is so much like Charles," she had written when William was 15. "He has that same sense of duty, that same careful way of thinking before he speaks. But he also has a warmth that Charles keeps hidden. William hugs me without hesitation, tells me he loves me, shows his emotions freely. I hope the royal system doesn't train that out of him the way it did his father." Diana's insights into their sons' personalities were remarkably perceptive. She wrote about William's natural leadership, his protective instincts toward Harry, his struggle to balance being a normal teenager with being second in line to the throne. She documented Harry's mischievous nature, his generous heart, his need for adventure and excitement. Harry got into trouble at school again. One entry read, "Nothing serious, he was just playing pranks trying to make his classmates laugh. The headmaster called it inappropriate behavior for a young prince. But I told him Harry is just being a normal boy. He needs to laugh and be silly and make mistakes. He has the rest of his life to be dignified." Charles smiled through his tears, remembering his own conversations with Harry's teachers. Diana had always been Harry's fierce defender, insisting on his right to be a child first and a prince second. The final entries Charles read from this section of the diary were about Diana's hopes for the future. She wrote about her dreams of expanding her humanitarian work, of finding a way to have a more normal relationship with the media, of maybe finding love again with someone who could handle the complexities of her life. "I won't live my whole life as the divorced princess," she had written just months before her death. "I'm 36 years old and I have so much more to give, so much more to experience. William and Harry are becoming independent young men who don't need me as much as they used to, which means I can focus more on the causes that matter to me. I want to make a real difference in the world, not just cut ribbons and give speeches." Charles closed the diary section, overwhelmed by Diana's optimism and determination. She had been planning for a future that would never come, dreaming dreams that would never be fulfilled. But she had also been at peace with herself in a way she had never been during their marriage. As he prepared to read the final entries, Charles braced himself for Diana's thoughts about her relationship with him after their divorce, and her hopes for how they might co-parent their sons despite everything that had happened between them. Charles's hands shook as he turned to the final section of Diana's diary, the entries from the last months of her life. Her handwriting seemed more hurried here, as if she had so much to say and feared running out of time to say it. The irony of that thought hit him like a physical blow. Had tea with Charles today to discuss William's birthday party she had written in June 1997. It Was the most civil conversation we've had in years. He actually asked about my charity work, seemed genuinely interested in the landmine campaign. For a moment, I remembered why I fell in love with him all those years ago. He can be so thoughtful when he lets his guard down. Charles remembered that meeting clearly. It had been one of their first attempts at a truly collaborative discussion about the boys since the divorce. He had been impressed by Diana's passion for her causes, her intelligence about complex global issues. For the first time in years, they had talked to each other rather than at each other. The entries that followed showed Diana reflecting on their relationship with a maturity that surprised Charles. She wrote about understanding now why their marriage had failed, not with bitterness but with genuine insight. I realize now that Charles and I were both victims of a system that cared more about appearances than about people, she had written. We were pushed together because it looked right on paper, the future king and the suitable bride. But nobody asked if we were compatible as human beings, if we could make each other happy, if we wanted the same things from life. We were actors cast in roles we never auditioned for. Diana's analysis of their failed marriage was more generous than Charles felt he deserved. She wrote about the pressure he had been under to marry and produce heirs, about the impossible expectations placed on both of them, about how young and unprepared they had both been for the scrutiny and responsibility. I don't blame Charles anymore, one entry read. I used to think he was cold and uncaring, but I understand now that he was just protecting himself the only way he knew how. He was raised to hide his emotions, to put duty before personal happiness, to never show weakness. I was raised to wear my heart on my sleeve, to believe in love conquering all, to expect fairy tale endings. We might as well have been from different planets. Charles wiped his eyes, amazed by Diana's compassion. Even in her private thoughts, she had found a way to forgive him, to understand the man he was rather than judging him for the man she had needed him to be. Diana's entries about their co-parenting relationship showed how hard both of them were working to put their sons first. She wrote about coordinating schedules, about making sure the boys felt secure and loved, despite their parents' divorce, about presenting a united front on discipline and expectations. William asked me today if Charles and I could ever be friends, Diana had written. I told him we were already working on it. And it's true, we are. Not the kind of friends who call each other for long chats, but the kind who can sit in the same room without tension, who can laugh at the same joke, who can work together for our children's sake. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's even better than what we had when we were married. Charles was moved by Diana's willingness to build a friendship with him. He had assumed she still harbored resentment. But her diary showed a woman genuinely committed to healing their relationship for their son's sake. The diary entries about William and Harry during this period were filled with pride and worry in equal measure. Diana wrote about William's growing maturity, his understanding of his future role, but also his normal teenage struggles with identity and responsibility. William is becoming such a fine young man, she had written after his 15th birthday. He has Charles's sense of duty, but also a warmth and empathy that will serve him well as king someday. But I worry about the weight of expectations on his shoulders. He's still just a boy who wants to play football and chase girls, but the world already sees him as the future monarch. Diana's entries about Harry were equally insightful. She wrote about his rebellious nature, his need to forge his own path, his struggle with being the spare rather than the heir. Harry came home from school in a mood today. One entry read, he's frustrated about always being compared to William, about living in his brother's shadow. I tried to explain that being second doesn't mean being second best, that he has his own important role to play. But how do you tell a 13-year-old that his worth isn't measured by whether he'll wear a crown someday? Diana's concern for Harry's emotional well-being was evident throughout her final entries. She wrote about his natural charisma, his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, his generous spirit that reminded her of her own desire to help others. The diary also revealed Diana's growing concerns about media intrusion into her sons' lives. She wrote about photographers following William to school, about Harry being upset by tabloid stories about their family, about her determination to protect them from the worst aspects of public life. The boys shouldn't have to pay for their parents' mistakes, she had written, after a particularly invasive article about their family. They didn't choose this life, this scrutiny, this constant judgment. I've made peace with being a public figure, but they're still children who deserve some privacy, some normalcy. Charles was struck by how fiercely protective Diana had been of their son's childhood. She had fought battles with the media that he hadn't even known about, shielding William and Harry from attention, while he focused on his own duties. The entries from Diana's final weeks were particularly poignant. She wrote about feeling more confident in her role as a humanitarian, more comfortable with her public image, more hopeful about the future than she had been in years. "I think I'm finally becoming the person I was meant to be," she had written in July 1997. "Not the perfect princess, the fairy tales promised. Not the bitter ex-wife the tabloids want to portray, but someone real. Someone who can use her position to make a difference. The landmine campaign is gaining momentum, and I have so many ideas for other causes that need attention." Diana's enthusiasm for her work was infectious, even on the page. She wrote about her plans to expand her humanitarian efforts, about learning to use her fame strategically rather than seeing it as a burden, about finding purpose in pain. The final entries about Charles showed a woman ready to let go of past hurts and move forward with genuine friendship. She wrote about their improving communication, about shared laughter during family events, about hope that they could model healthy co-parenting for other divorced couples. "Charles and I had dinner tonight to discuss the boys' summer plans," her second-to-last entry read. "For the first time in years it felt natural, comfortable. We even laughed about some of our old arguments, seeing how silly they seem now. I think we're both different people than we were when we married, and maybe these different people could actually be friends." But it was Diana's final entry that broke Charles completely. Written just 3 days before her death, it was a reflection on happiness, forgiveness, and hope. "I feel peaceful tonight," she had written. "The boys are growing into wonderful young men who will make the world better just by being in it. My charity work is finally having real impact, changing policies and saving lives. I'm learning to be happy alone, which means if love comes again, it will be because I want it, not because I need it. And Charles and I have found a way to be family again, not as husband and wife, but as two people who created something beautiful together and want to protect it." The entry continued. "I forgive Charles for not being able to love me the way I needed to be loved. I forgive myself for not understanding sooner that love can't be forced or manufactured, only given freely. Our marriage was a mistake, but our children are miracles, and if our pain was the price for their existence, then I would pay it again gladly." Charles was sobbing uncontrollably now, the diary falling from his hands onto the desk. Diana's final words to herself were words of forgiveness, peace, and hope. She had found a way to transform their shared tragedy into wisdom, their failed love into friendship, their mistakes into lessons. He picked up the diary again, reading her last paragraph through blurred vision. "I hope the boys remember that their parents loved them more than life itself, even when we couldn't love each other. I hope they learn from our mistakes, that they choose love over duty, happiness over appearances, truth over convenience. And I hope Charles finds peace with himself someday. He's a better man than he believes, and he deserves happiness too." Charles closed the diary and sat in the growing daylight, overwhelmed by grief, guilt, and gratitude. Diana had given him a gift more precious than he could have imagined: the truth about their marriage, about herself, and about the woman he had lost before he ever really knew her. Through her words, he finally understood the extraordinary person Diana had been. Not the icon the world mourned, but the real woman who had struggled and grown and forgiven, who had loved their sons with fierce devotion, and had somehow found a way to love him too, even after everything that had gone wrong between them. Charles sat motionless in his chair as the morning sun streamed through the windows of Highgrove. Diana's diary closed before him. The silence felt sacred now, heavy with the weight of revelations that had fundamentally changed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his marriage, about Diana, and about himself. He stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting all night, and walked to the window overlooking the gardens that Diana had written about so lovingly. She had understood his passion for this place, for the organic farming and sustainable practices that others had mocked as eccentric. In her diary, she had written about watching him tend to his plants with a gentleness he rarely showed to people, and she had wished he would bring that same care to their relationship. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He had nurtured his gardens with patience and attention, understanding that growth took time, that different plants had different needs, that forcing things to bloom before they were ready only led to failure. Yet he had never applied that same wisdom to his marriage. He had expected Diana to flourish in the rigid protocols of royal life, without considering what she might have needed to truly thrive. Charles picked up the diary again, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. 20 years of Diana's thoughts, fears, hopes, and dreams were contained within these pages. 20 years of a life he had shared but never truly understood. He thought about all the times he could have asked her what she was writing, all the moments when he could have shown genuine interest in her inner world. Instead, he had respected her privacy to the point of indifference, mistaking emotional distance for good manners. The morning light revealed how exhausted he looked in his reflection in the window glass. His eyes were red and swollen, his face aged by a single night of truth. But beneath the grief he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. For the first time since Diana's death, he understood not just what he had lost, but who he had lost. He thought about their sons, now young men who carried pieces of both their parents within them. William had Diana's empathy, but Charles's sense of duty. Harry had Diana's rebellious spirit, but Charles's deep loyalty to family. They were living proof that something beautiful had come from the wreckage of their marriage, something that would outlast both their parents' mistakes and their love. Charles walked to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. For the first time in months, he felt compelled to write, not a speech or a formal letter, but something personal. He began slowly, the words coming haltingly at first, then flowing more freely. "My dearest Diana," he wrote, knowing she would never read these words but needing to write them anyway. "I have spent this night reading your diary, and I finally understand the woman I was married to but never really knew. I see now the pain I caused through my emotional distance, the loneliness you felt in a marriage that should have been a partnership, the strength you showed in finding your own purpose despite my failure to value you as you deserved." He paused, remembering her words about forgiveness, about understanding why their marriage had failed without assigning blame. He continued writing, "You wrote that you forgave me, but I'm not sure I can forgive myself. Not for not loving you. I did love you, though I was too proud and too frightened to show it properly. I can't forgive myself for not seeing how extraordinary you were, while I still had the chance to tell you." Charles wrote about their early days, about moments when he had felt genuine affection for her but had held back, constrained by his upbringing and his fear of vulnerability. He wrote about watching her with William and Harry, seeing her natural warmth and wondering why he couldn't access that same emotional freedom. He wrote about the charity work she had thrown herself into, work that he now realized had been her way of healing the world because she couldn't heal their marriage. "I read about your relationship with Hasnat Khan," he continued, "and I'm glad you found someone who could appreciate your mind and your heart in ways I never learned to. I read about your hopes for the future, your plans to expand your humanitarian work, your dreams of finding lasting love. It breaks my heart that those dreams were cut short. But it comforts me to know that in your final months, you had found peace and purpose." He wrote about their last dinner together, about how natural their conversation had felt, about the hope he had begun to harbor that they might finally achieve the friendship Diana had written about. He had been planning to call her after her holiday, to suggest they work together on some charitable project, to build on the foundation of mutual respect they had begun to establish. "The boys are becoming the men you dreamed they would be," Charles wrote. "William has your compassion and your understanding of how to connect with people. Harry has your courage and your willingness to challenge convention. They speak of you constantly, sharing memories that keep you alive in our daily lives. They know how much you love them, and they're growing into young men who would make you incredibly proud." Charles thought about the public memorial they were planning, about the tributes that would focus on Diana's charitable work and her role as a mother. But those public remembrances would only capture part of who she had been. The Diana he had discovered in her diary was more complex, more thoughtful, more forgiving than the simplified version the world would remember. He sealed the letter in an envelope, knowing he would keep it with Diana's diary, a private conversation between two people who had finally found understanding, even if it came too late. Then he picked up the phone to call William and Harry. It was time to share some of their mother's thoughts with them, to help them understand not just the public figure they had inherited from her, but the private woman who had loved them with such fierce devotion. As he waited for the call to connect, Charles looked again at Diana's diary. Reading it had been one of the most painful experiences of his life. but also one of the most important. It had given him back the real Diana, not the saint or the victim the media had created, but the complicated, passionate, flawed, and ultimately triumphant woman she had actually been. The phone rang, and he heard William's voice on the other end. "Father, is everything all right? You sound different." Charles smiled, thinking of Diana's last entry, of her hope that her family could find peace and happiness. "I'm all right, William. Actually, I think I might be better than I've been in a very long time. I wanted to talk to you and Harry about your mother. There are some things about her I think you should know. Some things she would want you to understand." As he began to speak, Charles felt something shift inside him. The grief was still there, would always be there, but alongside it was gratitude. Diana had given him one final gift through her diary, the chance to really know her, to understand their story, and to honor her memory not with guilt or regret, but with truth and love. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the gardens that Diana had loved to read about in his letters. Charles spoke quietly into the phone, sharing his wife's words with their sons, finally ready to celebrate the remarkable woman who had changed all their lives, even in her absence. In reading her truth, he had found a path to his own healing and to the kind of father and man Diana had always believed he could be.